Hello, this video is an accompaniment to Chapter 10 in the Livingston text, Views of the Human Problem. All religions, of course, agree that this life is on many levels unsatisfactory, and one of the key questions that people ask is, what's wrong with the human being? What is it that makes humans imperfect, makes them corrupt, makes them dissatisfied? And so this chapter is going to give you four different religions / philosophies. Some people would not consider Stoicism a religion for sure, but it gives you four different ways of looking at this problem just so you can begin to compare and contrast them. Now, when I say Stoicism is not considered as a religion, I mentioned this before in the Axial Age video, but during the Axial Age in Greece, the main schools of philosophy, some of the main schools of philosophy that arise then are still foundational today. For instance, Stoicism, Platonism, Aristotelianism, Epicureanism. And so Stoicism, Platonism, and Aristotelianism all seem to acknowledge that there is some kind of a higher reality, some kind of an ultimate good. So why wouldn't they be called religions then if they're saying something about what your relationship to this ultimate good should be? And as I mentioned before, the answer is because they're living in a polytheistic society, and religion in Greece means worshiping the pantheon of Greek gods. So anything that does not focus on your responsibility and the correct way to worship the pantheon of Greek gods is not going to be considered a religion. Again, we did discuss this to some extent in the Axial Age video, so you can revisit that if you're more interested in that. I did give you some examples of that. Anyway, in the very beginning of the chapter here, there are a few things mentioned other than the four main religions / philosophies that are going to be discussed in the chapter. The ones that are going to be discussed in the chapter at length are Christianity and Stoicism, Theravada Buddhism, and Confucianism. And but in the very beginning, just to introduce this, the book again acknowledges that life is not what it should be, and that human beings experience hostility and estrangement. I swear I can talk. A profound disquiet provoked by shame, moral guilt, and failure. We seek enlightenment, reconciliation, forgiveness, and peace. So we're trying to fix what's wrong with the human condition. And the book gives a few examples just in the very introduction here that aren't going to be really talked about in the book much, but I'll catch them really quickly. I'm not going to get everything because you should have read the book already. And it does talk about Ram Dass's Richard Alpert's enlightenment experience under the influence of LSD. It goes on to mention Karl Marx. I will say one thing about Marx that's important. We've talked about Marx a lot, but I want you to remember that Marx believes that we're alienated and unhappy because in an industrialist capitalist society, our work and our objects we produce are alien to us. And that's an exact quote from the top of page 213 here. Humans are estranged and miserable, according to Marx, because they find no satisfaction in their productive work. Now, as we mentioned before, Marx really wanted the masses of common people to stand up to the factory owners and those who were exploiting their labors, paying them much less than what they were worth. And the common people would not do it. And the reason they would not do it was because they were worried about not fulfilling God's will, not inheriting the promises that God had assured them that they would have when the life is over. And Freud, of course, was very frustrated with the fact that religious legitimation kept the common people from demanding better treatment. As we mentioned before, he did not like the way that religion legitimated the privilege of the 1%, so to speak, and convinced the common people that those people were in power because it was God's will, and that it was God's will that those people were faithful in the vocation where God had put them, and that they submitted to the powers that be. And the second thing that was really, we talked a little bit about, was Marx talking about why they would not rebel, and also this strange kind of comfort they had in all of their adversity. And he talked about this comfort that religion gives them and called it the opiate of the masses. And if you remember, we talked about this and what opium and morphine do to people. And you can be in the midst of a very, very unfortunate situation, but with a respectable dose of morphine, everything's going to seem just like it's fine. So that was actually a great metaphor that Marx used. The one thing that I want to bring back to your attention now, and this is going to be important for this, is that Marx wants to reform society. He wants to change the social structure radically to fix the problem with human nature and so on. And of course, he wasn't successful in doing it in his lifetime, but after his lifetime, there were a number of experiments with Marxism and different forms of socialism and communism that, of course, were less than optimally successful. Anyway, so let's remember this here. Marx wants to reform society. It mentions Sigmund Freud here, and I don't really need to return to him again. It then goes on, 213, to mention Plato, which again is one of those axial age philosophical schools that is born in Greece, like Stoicism. And Platonism does share some things in common with Stoicism. Plato believes that rationalism is the answer, that our power to pursue philosophical understanding is what elevates us above the common state of the human. And he actually goes so far as to say that if you want society to be just, if you want society to be all that it can be in this flawed world, then the philosophers need to be the kings, and the kings need to become the philosophers. And if you've ever taken an introduction to philosophy, that's certainly a topic that is covered, probably fairly early in the semester there. I don't need to say too much more about Marx. It does go on and give you a little bit of an introduction to Confucianism, Judaism, Christianity, Theravada, but we're going to talk about those, so I'm going to skip that. One thing, though, I want to tell you that is very, very important, and that is in the context of comparison and contrast. Things don't fit neatly into one category. You might find some religions, take two religions, A and B, and they might very much agree on one particular issue, but then on another issue, they are just, diametrically opposed to each other. And so comparison and contrast is a process of seeing what things have in common with each other and the ways that they completely differ with each other. And of course, there's a lot of things in between that are kind of subtle. Some areas of agreement, some areas of difference. Maybe they believe in the same kind of principles, but in different contexts. And so I want to give you one example of that just to start out here, just to get you thinking this way, okay? Confucianism and Marxism, in fact, on 214, the book actually gives you kind of a prelude to this, and you'll see this later, that both classical Chinese Confucianism, born in the axial age, and Marxism, of course, born much, much later, would say that the human problem lies in alienated social relationships. And so again, let me put this in other words. In some way, to fix human beings, society must be fixed. Whatever is wrong with human beings and with their lack of fulfillment in life, it has to do with the fact that society is somehow screwed up. Okay, society is unjust, is not arranged correctly. So Marxism and Chinese Confucianism very much agree that the problem is in society and society needs to be fixed. On the other hand, though, there are many things that they very much disagree with. Gongfuzi, which is Confucius. Confucius is a Latinism. Just like Mencius is a Latinism. His name would be pronounced Mengsa. But Gongfuzi, or Confucius, very much accepts the Chinese belief in the kingdom of heaven and the mandate of heaven, that rulers rule by the appointment of heaven and must rule ethically according to the ethical guidelines of heaven, or they'll be removed from office. And so he does believe there is an ethical power in the world, not seeing heaven quite the same way we do, but seeing it as an ethical power in the world. And we'll talk more about this when we get to Confucianism. Of course, Marx believes nothing of the kind. Marx is a philosophical atheist and has really nothing good to say about religion at all. Of course, most of what he's thinking of when he thinks of religion is, of course, Christianity and Judaism, and to a lesser degree, maybe Islam, but he's less familiar with that. I don't know how much he knew about Far Eastern religions, but he certainly wasn't thinking about Confucianism when he launched his critiques of religious legitimation of an unjust and stratified society. So again, what would they agree upon? Marxism and Confucianism would both say the answer is fixing society. Society's screwed up, we got to fix it. Humans cannot have a fulfilling life until you fix the society that they live in. But they would very much disagree on the fact that there is some kind of a divine power, some kind of a transcendent ethical power existent. Confucius would say yes, would accept that, and of course Karl Marx doesn't believe that at all. He's a philosophical atheist. So that's just one example of how we're going to try to compare things here. And I'm not going to do it all for you, but I just want you to get thinking in that way, comparing the things that are similar, but then remembering that there are things that are very, very different. You're going to see some other examples of this as we go on. And I'll remind you of this one later on, too. Now, he just gives you a prelude here, Livingston, on 214. Judaism and Christianity, of course, Islam, see our problem rooted in a disobedience towards God's will, and that we have some kind of a problem with an inherent sinful will, where we always do tend to have this proclivity to rebel. Theravada Buddhism sees something different. And I'm not going to give you the author's exact wordings here because he's kind of making a conclusion before he's taken you all the way to it, and it doesn't make too much sense. But he believes that human beings are responsible for creating most of their own existential suffering. There's some sufferings in life that you can't get away from, but there's some that we make a whole lot worse. And we're going to talk about how we do that later on. We're going to start first, though, with Stoicism, and I'm not going to say too much about it. But Stoicism believes that the world is, as it says on 215, an ordered whole, governed and permeated by a divine reason and divine law or God. And the word that Stoicism uses for this is the logos. Now, if you happen to be a Christian or you've ever read the Gospels, the fourth Gospel, the Gospel of John, is the one that's written the latest, near the end of the first century. And the writer of the Gospel of John is apparently trying to find some kind of a connection with Stoic and perhaps Platonic ideas. And so the writer actually mentions the logos that Stoicism introduces, but the writer of the Gospel of John refers to the logos as being in the beginning with God, and the logos is actually what God uses to create the world. Now, in the Gospel of John, logos is usually translated as the Word or the Word of God, but logos has a much broader meaning than that. Logos is where we get logi, at the end of sociology or psychology or theology. And so when we talk, and it's where the word logic comes from. Obviously, logic is human reasoning, and that's what logi means. So when you talk about the logos or you talk about logi, you're talking about the sum total of human reasoning or knowledge on any given subject. So when you talk about theology, you're talking about everything humans have reasoned or think they know about God. Psychology, everything they think or know about the human psyche, and so on. So logos, if you wanted to interpret it in a Christian sense that kind of incorporated this broader application, you might say in a Christian sense that the logos was the sum total of everything that God had ever revealed or communicated about himself, everything that humans had been able to think about God. You might think of it that way. And so it does mean something like word in the sense of communication, whatever God has chosen to communicate in some way about himself. But again, the meaning of the word is much broader than that. So Stoicism does believe there is some kind of ultimate power or reality that is just, that is pure, that is in control. And that would be something that it has in common, with Platonism, Aristotelianism, Christianity, for that matter, Confucianism, as we just mentioned. But the thing about Stoicism that most people know about is supposedly that Stoics do not have extreme emotional responses to unfortunate situations. Sometimes if a crisis is happening, and somebody, and it's the kind of crisis where a lot of people would be very emotional or distraught. And there is somebody who does not seem to really be responding in an emotional way, but seems to be acting in a mature, balanced way. Someone might say, "Oh, he's acting very stoic, very stoically," and so a lot of people think stoic means you're unemotional, and I guess in a shallow sense that is correct, but Stoicism believes that there are certain things that are going to happen. They're like fate. You can't control them. And so if every time something happens that you can't control, you get thrown into a crisis, you're going to be in a crisis for most of your life. You're going to have as many days where you are emotionally distraught as days where you are happy. And so obviously this is not a good way to live. So what Stoicism stresses is that resisting the inevitable, is to be miserable. Things are going to happen. People you love are going to die. You're going to get sick. You're going to try to do good things and bad things are going to happen. You're going to see all kinds of injustice where bad things happen to good people, good things happen to bad people, natural disasters, whatever. In many ways, even personal ways, you are going to be assaulted. You are going to experience things that are hurtful. And we have to recognize that these things happen. This is the way life is. And the more you recognize that it's normal that these things happen and that they happen to everybody, the less upset you get about it. One of the things that makes people really upset when bad things happen is they have this idea that this should not be happening. This is just wrong. They have a wrong idea about how things ought to be. And maybe we get that from Disney movies or, whatever. But society, as we've talked about before a couple times, really does promote wrong ideas of what success and happiness are and what a healthy life should be for someone who's living the right way. And of course, there are many people who are trying to live the right way that are good people, but have terrible things happen to them. And certainly their lives don't resemble the standard of what the normal life is supposed to be. So the first thing you have to do is realize that the normal life that's being promoted is not normal at all. It is normal for people to experience injustice. It is normal for people to experience trauma and disappointment, loss, tragedy. And when you realize that this is normal and everybody experiences these things, somehow it makes it easier to accept them when they happen. The next thing that might be a healthy way of looking at it is that no matter how upset you get, you're not going to change it. If it decides to rain today and I don't want it to rain and I scream and yell and cuss and cry, it's not going to change the weather. So getting upset does no good whatsoever. And that's the second thing from a very practical point of view that's easy to understand. So if having some kind of an emotional breakdown does absolutely no good at all, it makes you miserable, why do you want to do it? You want to respond in a way that is, first of all, going to promote the greatest peace or fulfillment or comfort for you, but also for those that you love. And having an emotional meltdown every time something goes wrong does not produce any kind of peace or comfort. It just keeps you living in misery. So Stoics are all about accepting that which you cannot control. And yes, it's regrettable. Nobody that loves someone is not going to experience profound grief if that person dies and they lose them. But the fact of the matter is these things happen. And you should be expecting things like this to happen. If you're not expecting things like this to happen and you're not prepared for them, then every time something goes wrong, you're going to be thrown into complete disarray. And again, your life is going to be tumultuous. You are going to be miserable a great deal of the time. So be honest and be realistic is a better word. Be realistic about the way life is for everybody. Accept that. And so then when these things happen that are not ideal, you're not disillusioned. You're not thrown for a loop. You know that things like this are going to happen, and you've already prepared yourself to respond in the best way that you can to these kinds of events. And take practical actions, maybe to mitigate, the damage from them. But when things are completely out of your control, there's no point screaming and yelling or crying. It just doesn't do any good. And so Stoicism is all about accepting what is, okay? Now, Stoicism says a lot about the natural law. And when you think of natural law, you can almost just think of fate or determinism. True freedom is the voluntary acceptance of the natural law. This is near the bottom of 215 here. The Stoics teach that a person must accept the apparent adversities of life and bad fortune, such as bereavement, pain, poverty, and death, because every person, although a slave or poor, can be spiritually free. Death is, of course, inevitable and must be accepted calmly as nature's law. And it gives you a real nice passage there that you can read at the bottom of 215 from one of the classic Stoics in the formative period. So true goodness and happiness on 216 here, according to Stoicism, is to know that we must live according to nature, to recognize the difference between what lies within our power and what lies beyond it. It almost sounds like the prayer of St. Francis a little bit, many, many centuries later. Remember? The wisdom to accept the things I can't change and the courage to change the things I can. Well, Stoicism is very much focused on having the wisdom to realize that a lot of the things that bother you, you can't change at all. So Stoicism, when it talks about not responding in an overly emotional way, it talks about a virtue called apatheia. Now, anybody immediately sees that this means apathy, and we don't usually think of apathy as a good thing. We usually use the word in a situation where you expect someone to care more, and they're not, and so you accuse them of being apathetic as if it's a problem. But in this case, the word apatheia or apathy is being used in a very positive sense, and that is that I am not going to react overly emotionally to something that is completely out of my control in the first place. I've already prepared myself to accept it. I've accepted this philosophy. I've prepared myself to accept these bad events. So when they happen, hopefully I can. So that's kind of what Stoicism is about. And that's everything we really need to talk about here. Your role in life is just to play your part well. Be the best person you can be. Respond in the best way you can. But you don't really control the things that are going to happen to you. You only control the way that you respond to them. You're supposed to respond in the best way. If life is like a play, then you are supposed to play your role the best way you can. Be the best actor that you can, in a sense, which is one of the metaphors that is sometimes used. All right. I think that's all we really need to say about Stoicism right now. I'm going to come back to it in a little bit, because, as I mentioned a few minutes before, we're going to talk about some things it has in common with another religion, and yet there are some things it very much disagrees with this same religion about. Kind of the same way we talked about the relationship, not really the relationship, but the contrast between Marxism and Confucianism, what they have in common, what they very much disagree upon. So we're going to come back to Stoicism a little bit later and compare it with something else and find the same kind of nuanced conclusion here. Christianity is next. I'm not going to talk as much about that, and I'll tell you why. Most people understand it very well. And even if you happen to be a Jew, or you happen to be a Muslim, or if you have grown up, knowing a lot about any of those religions, and most of you are more familiar with monotheism than anything else, then I'm not really introducing something new to you. But I'm going to point out a few things about Christianity that are very, very important. Okay. First of all, Christianity, just like Judaism and Islam in some sense, believes that humans are created in the image of God, or in the likeness of God. But something about this image of God maybe was not completely lost, but it was at least compromised when humans rebelled against God. And of course, the story is told in Genesis chapter 3, the story of Adam and Eve doing the one thing that God told them don't do. Just don't eat of this one particular tree. They only had one rule, and they just couldn't keep from breaking it. And since then, because of this fall, humans have been alienated from God and trying to get back to God since then. And the whole story of Christianity is God, in his mercy, trying to reach out to human beings and bring them back. Okay. But we have this problem, and that is that we have kind of this sin disease, some people call it. We have this propensity to sin. And so Christianity is very much concerned with some kind of a transformation that gives you perhaps some of the power that was lost in the fall, but some power to be able to resist your normal tendency to sin and to live in a holier way. And it also, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, all stress the mercy of God, repenting to God and accepting his mercy so that you can get back into fellowship or relationship with God, to get back into harmony with God. And most of us have heard a lot about this. Now, it goes on a little bit farther here to talk about differences between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. Protestantism, of course, is only about 502 years old as of the time of me recording this video, whereas, of course, the life of Jesus is more like 2,000 years ago. So Protestantism, of the three main forms of Christianity, is Johnny-come-lately, so to speak. But Protestantism was born in Martin Luther's rejection of certain things in Catholicism that he thought had deviated from the truth of the gospel. And he was not alone. There were many before him that had been put to death for heresy, that had said the same kinds of things, but Luther's considered the father of the Protestant Reformation because he's the first one that they couldn't catch and kill. The Prince of Wittenberg, Germany, protected him and wouldn't turn him over to the Vatican. And but it talks here about Martin Luther and also John Calvin, which is another major leader of the Protestant Reformation. And according to Luther, the divine image that was lost in the fall is the freedom of the human will. He thinks that we've lost the freedom of will. And so, again, Calvin is very much against the whole idea of free will. And we have another theologian in the same century, 16th century, who very much emphasizes free will. And his name is Jacobus Arminius, and it's where we get this conflict between Calvinism and Arminianism. And if you remember, near the beginning of the semester, we did actually talk about how contemporary Christianity is kind of split down the middle. Protestant Christianity is kind of split down the middle between Calvinist versus Arminian ideas. And we talked about that paradox. How can God be completely in control of everything and sovereign, and at the same time be completely just, not want suffering to exist, not want evil to exist? Well, if God's completely sovereign and in control, and he doesn't want evil to exist, evil should not exist. And this is the problem of theodicy. And we are going to talk about theodicy in a future chapter. It is a very interesting study. And it might be one of the most interesting chapters to you because it really does relate to how we respond to all of the evil, all of the injustice in the world, if we really do believe in a kind and just and all-powerful God. How do we reconcile this paradox? A paradox is two things that cannot both be true at the same time according to any logical reasoning. God can't be in control of everything and just, and yet have injustice exist. It just doesn't work. So we talked earlier about how Calvinists and Arminians approach the problem differently. Arminians stress the goodness of God and the justice of God, but they say that in his sovereignty, he has chosen not to be sovereign for a period of time until the times progress in the way he knows that they're going to, and at a time in the future, which everybody's looking forward to in the eschaton, he's going to step back in and take control of things. However, he might intervene here and there up until that time. Calvinists look at it the other way around. What they're most interested in is believing in a sovereign God. So even if something looks unjust or unrighteous, they would say, no, God is incapable of being unrighteous. If it looks unrighteous, it's because we don't have the capability to understand true righteousness. God's righteousness is beyond ours. Again, we've discussed this before, so I hope it's ringing some bells. These are things I hope that you're remembering. So let's go back here, and the book wants to talk about the image of God. And this is an interesting discussion because when we're talking about the problem of evil and the idea that we're supposed to have some kind of fellowship with God, we're supposed to be recognizing the image of God in us. There's been a lot of discussion in Christian theology and other monotheistic theology as to what the image of God is. And so the book gives you a few ideas that we've been talking about here. One of them would say reason, and this is one of the oldest ones, the idea that we're reasoning. And we reason, we've talked about this before, so I won't go over everything that makes the human different from the reasoning of other animals, but we've talked about how we can reason on a different level than other mammals can. Some people say it's human creativity, imagining things that don't exist and figuring out a way to make them exist. And this is something that's, of course, beyond other animals as well. The other main thing that people mention is our moral or our ethical sense, that we can look at things and we can think about what is right and what is wrong. And other animals really don't think about that. If you've got a dog that you've trained, not to do this, the dog hasn't really learned that it's wrong per se. He's learned that when he does it, he gets swatted with a newspaper. You yell at him, and he doesn't do it because, this is just behavioral modification. He doesn't like what happens when he's in that situation, so he stops putting himself in that situation. He's not thinking about it that deeply. So again, the three big ones are reason, creativity, and moral response. But there is a fourth idea, a very compelling idea, of the imago Dei, as they call it here in Latin, the image of God. And this is in the writings of the Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr on 220, And for him, it is human transcendence, or self-transcendence. Now, we talked about this early in the semester when I talked about how humans are the only, mammal that can, in a sense, step outside of ourselves. I called it abstracting yourself. You step outside yourself, you kind of look back at yourself and see what you look like. Who am I? What am I? Do I look good? Do I look bad? How do other people see me? Am I the way I should be? What do I like? What do I not like? Other animals can't do this. And we mentioned no Cocker Spaniel looks in the mirror and goes, am I a good dog or a bad dog? What's my responsibility as a dog? Do other dogs like me? Only humans do that kind of stuff. And this is self-transcendence, abstracting yourself and being able to think about who and what you are and whether that's okay or whether it's not. So this is the thing that the Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr thinks really is the image of God in us. And again, we call that self-transcendence, the ability to transcend ourselves, okay? And about halfway down on 220, it says, human self-transcendence involves self-determination or freedom, which is the key to genuine selfhood. This is the source, obviously, of human creativity, but it's also the source of human destructiveness there. So Reinhold Niebuhr goes on to show how this self-transcendence can have very, very good results or effects, but it also can have very, very bad effects. And I'll let you read this section on your own here. And I'm probably not going to ask you about, how can self-transcendence have good effects and bad effects? I'm not going to ask you about that, okay? But it's an interesting discussion. It's a little deeper than I want to go in this video. Next, it talks about Augustine's view, St. Augustine's view, or you can say Augustine if you like, Augustine of Hippo, about the total depravity of the human being, that we, trying to find a nice little quote here. St. Augustine spoke of it, this is the 4th century, by the way, and early 5th century, spoke of this as original sin. And this is his term. And by the way, it's a term that both Martin Luther and Calvin also accept. Calvin makes a very big deal about original sin. And the idea is that we're born with sin. Whether or not we, guilty of sin when we're born, you can argue about that, but it doesn't make much difference, because whether you're guilty of sin, whether you're born or not, it's inevitable you're going to. At some point, you will mature to the point, I don't know if it's, age 3 or age 5, or people disagree, but at some point, every human being makes a choice to do something that they know and believe is wrong just because they want to do it. And so it's inevitable that whether we're, born a sinner, we're going to sin at some point. So we're born with this sinful nature. And again, he calls this original sin. It's almost like a disease that's been passed down from Adam and Eve in the teachings of many people. So this sin, condemns us to ignorance and pride and competition. And again, we don't have the ability not to sin on our own. We need not only the mercy of God, but we need some kind of transformative power of God to enable us to begin to overcome sin. And once again, nourish this relationship with God, nourish this image of God in us, and live more like the people we're supposed to be. We'll never quite get it right. We're always going to need the mercy of God to forgive the things that we will never overcome. But there can be a major change in your life, but it's only by the miraculous power of God that you're able to overcome this sinful nature, according to Augustine, anyway. And there have been theological debates about this, but those on the side of Augustine have almost always won. One of the famous early debates in the 4th century is Augustine and a monk named Pelagius. Pelagius thinking that we're basically, born with a clean slate, we're born as good people, and, somehow we get tempted to sin and we make the same choice that Adam and Eve did. But he kind of rejects the idea that we're born with a sinful nature, or we're born as being guilty of sin. And Augustine and Pelagius get in a big argument about it. It's finally settled at the Council of Orange, if I remember right. And Augustine is really the winner. Now, everything Augustine says is not completely accepted, but most of it is. Pelagius is condemned as a heretic, and he's known as a heretic to this day. Again, not going to question you on that, but know that Augustine and Calvin and certainly Paul the Apostle in the Bible talk very much about the fact that humans are prone to sin, have some kind of a sinful nature that must be overcome by the power of God. We won't talk about these concepts in as much depth as we do in REL 2300 on world religions, but I want to introduce some of the main concepts in Theravada Buddhism. The slides are not going to be behind me through the entire presentation as they have been on some of the other slideshows. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the slides right now. You have them in your files area of your Canvas website if you're one of my students. If not, you're welcome to take screenshots of them right now as I show them to you. This is the first one, called the Four Noble Truths. After this one, the next slide is key concepts here, talking about dukkha, anicca, anatta, the skandhas, nirvana, and karma. The third slide is not something you need to know, but when we mention the 5 skandhas, I'll talk to you a little bit about what they are, but you're not going to be quizzed on this at all. The fourth slide is just a recap. You can read it later on just to kind of give you a brief explanation of how some of the concepts work together, anicca, tana, dukkha, anatta, and so on. The Eightfold Path you do not need to know at all. I've just put it here in case you're interested and you want to research it more. And finally, the major families of Buddhism. We're talking about Theravada today, obviously, but anything that is not Theravada falls in the category of Mahayana. There are many different forms of Mahayana: Zen, Pure Land, Vajrayana, also called Tibetan, Nichiren, Tendai, Soka Gakkai, many others. And the third category there is Vajrayana, which is actually a form of Mahayana. Today we're going to talk strictly about Theravada. Theravada is called the tradition of the elders. The thing that makes Theravada distinctive is that after the Buddha died at 80, they did not want to add anything else to his teachings, to their sacred scriptures, if you will, except for his teachings when he was on earth, the stories of his life, and expositions on those things. In the Tripitaka, or the 3 baskets. Mahayana has many other scriptures they've added over the centuries, and they have some very different ideas on some of the things. But Theravada, in my opinion, is much, much closer to the understanding of the Buddha's first couple generations of disciples in terms of how they understood his teachings when he was here on earth. Alrighty, so heading back here to the beginning, and we will get started looking at the Four Noble Truths. Rather than follow Livingston's outline in the book, I'm not going to disagree with anything, but I'm going to present it in a slightly different way that I think works a little bit better, and whatever you like better is fine. If you like Livingston better than me, I won't get offended. I want to start with what's called the Four Noble Truths. And the first truth, that Siddhartha Gautama, he's called the Buddha, which means the enlightened one, or the awakened one, after he attains the enlightenment to see this truth. All life involves suffering. All life involves suffering. The term is dukkha. And everybody would agree with this. Everybody agrees that, there's suffering in the world. It's inevitable. And some of it is unavoidable. Every baby that's born comes out screaming and crying. That must be a very traumatic experience. Isn't it good we don't remember that? Man, if you remember being born, you'd probably have severe childhood PTSD for the rest of your life, right? Anyway, and there's all kinds of suffering in life that's just inevitable. But we make it worse. We make it a lot worse. And I like to speak of it as existential suffering. In other words, it affects our entire existence. We are suffering because what is happening, as far as we are concerned, is not right. It should not be. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about this. But the second noble truth is that the cause of suffering is desire. Now, many times you will hear this, that the cause of suffering is craving. And that's a good translation of the word tana, you see there. The reason I put desire instead of craving, well, let me tell you what's right and what's a problem with craving. What's good about craving is that there's an intensity. I mean, you very deeply desire something that you think ought to be. You crave for it to be true. You crave to realize it. The problem with craving, though, is when we think of craving, we usually think of it as a negative desire, kind of like a lust or something, you know. Most people don't say, I'm just craving for my child to get into a good school, or I'm just craving to do well on the exam, or we don't use craving that way. We normally use it for something that's a little bit more, I don't know, carnal or something. So you can use it if you realize that we're not saying we're only talking about bad desires, okay? If I have a beautiful little daughter, go back to one of my same hypothetical stories, I have a beautiful little daughter who's 8 years old playing in the front yard and she gets run down by a drunk driver. Do I suffer? Yes, deeply. And was it a bad desire that I wanted her to grow up and have a happy life and one day meet a man that loved her, have children of her own, have a nice house? And is there anything wrong with any of those desires? Of course not. And yet I still suffer when she's killed because I desired for her to stay alive. Now, we'll talk more about this in a minute because the desire for her to stay alive, well, once she's gone, she's not suffering. I mean, she's either in heaven dancing with the angels or she doesn't exist, whatever you happen to believe, but she's not suffering. The person suffering is me. So it really is kind of all about me and how this affects me. And we're going to get to that in just a second here, okay? Next, I want you to write this down. This is important. We talked about desire. We talked about craving. There are two other words that are very, very important that you understand this relates to, and they are hope and expectation. Now, in some situations, desire, hope, expectation, one of them might work a little better than others. But all of them represent a value judgment that we make about how things ought to be. Okay? Obviously, if I say desire, I'm, hoping that something is going to happen in the future, perhaps. But an expectation would be more something that I think I have the right to. I expect life to always be this way. So you can see a little bit difference in the words here. Anyway, everybody suffers based on expectations. I tell a story sometimes, it's kind of silly, but it gets the point across. Imagine a movie star, and she has been nominated for Academy Awards before. Maybe she's won a couple. And so anyway, they're having an Academy Awards banquet this year, and she's nominated again. So she tells her chauffeur to go down, and she says, last year we went in my Rolls Royce, so this year let's take the Bentley. Go get the Bentley going for me. And so a few minutes later, the chauffeur comes back up and says, ma'am, I'm sorry, but the Bentley will not start. The battery's dead. I think the alternator's bad. We're going to have to take the Rolls Royce again. And the actress throws a fit. She's screaming, she's yelling, she's kicking holes in the wall, she's breaking priceless Ming Dynasty vases. Is her suffering real? Well, yes, absolutely. And some of you might have instinctively said, no, but that's only because you don't think that she should be reacting that way. I mean, she lives such a privileged life. Who the hell is she to complain that she has to go in a Rolls Royce instead of a Bentley? I mean, God forbid that everybody would think that she, can't afford more than one exorbitantly priced luxury car, right? Here's another story. There's a woman that's living in a refugee camp, say in the Sudan, a nation that's been torn by civil war for so long, where people are dying of disease and starvation in refugee camps. And there's a young mother who is sitting there with her 6-month-old child in her arms, and the child has just died. She's actually suffering less than the movie star. That doesn't mean she doesn't love the child, okay? You don't tell how much you love somebody by how much you scream and cry and go crazy if you lose them. That's just how much you accept the inevitability of loss. That's not love at all. That's how much you're upset by the way this affects you and what you have lost. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But she's actually suffering less, at least in an existential sense. Why? because she expected it to happen. She might have lost another child, a couple months before. Maybe her, neighbor living in the shack next to her lost her child last week. In this kind of a shanty city, if you will, children die. A lot of them are starving and they have diseases, and that's just the way life is. It doesn't mean she doesn't love the child, but she expected it to happen. She saw the writing on the wall. This is going to turn out just like the last 15 times did. The child is dead. On the other hand, the actress is unwilling to accept the possibility that at some point an expensive car might not start. She thinks that because of who she is and what she is and how much money she spent on the cars and what everybody expects of her and how much she's above everybody else, that she deserves to have those cars run whenever she snaps her fingers and says, I want to drive it. And she's unwilling to accept that that's not the way life is. So again, suffering's based on expectations. If I get home, and I find out I have no electricity and everything in my freezer is melting, I have no internet, I can't do my job. Do I suffer? Yes, a great deal. Because I expected electricity to be there. But all over the world, people come home and have no electricity, and they don't suffer because they didn't expect it to be there. So the first thing I want you to get is everyone suffers based on expectations, okay? Suffering comes from desires based on value judgments. That's the second thing. We make a value judgment, what should be and what should not be. And sometimes our value judgments are really, really silly. Let me just give you one. I have a lot of Latino and Latina friends, and some of my Latina friends have just beautiful hair. I call it Cher hair. Long, shiny, just gorgeous. And, until it gets hit with about 5 raindrops, and then their hair goes poof. Do they suffer? Oh, yeah. I can't believe he saw me like this. Yes, they suffer deeply, because they don't want to look that way. You've heard of a bad hair day and what a crisis it can be? Oh, hell yeah. They've made a decision that their hair looks better, or that they're a better person when they have hair that looks like Cher than hair that looks like Ronald McDonald. But that doesn't make them a worse person or a better person, okay? This is a value judgment that's ridiculous. But we make value judgments like that all the time. A lot of people have deep, deep, deep suffering because of a bad hair day. Accepting contingencies is a better way of looking at things. Imagine I have a day off. And I get my heart set on my day off of going to the beach and laying out on the beach and getting a tan because I'm a pasty white boy that needs to fix this. And so on my day off, I wake up at 8 in the morning and the rain is just thundering on my roof. And I'm very, very upset because I got my heart set on going to the beach and getting that tan. On the other hand, let's imagine the same story. I've got a day off, but let's say I've been very sleep deprived, which is often the case. And let's say I decide tomorrow morning, I'm not getting out of bed. I'm staying in bed till noon, until I feel like getting up. And so I wake up, same story, 8 o'clock in the morning. I hear the rain thundering on the roof. Do I suffer? Not a bit. In fact, it's almost therapeutic. It's like Mother Nature's tucking me back into sleep. So again, same story, but in one case, I'm profoundly distraught. And on the other case, I'm just fine with the way things are. Wouldn't it be better to accept the possibility that it might rain and it might be sunny and say, well, if it rains, I'll just stay in bed and catch up on sleep, or maybe I'll get some reading done, and if it's sunny, I'm going to go to the beach and then I'll go, why don't we just make plans for both the contingencies? Okay? Making a value judgment, which is better and which is worse, is sometimes kind of silly. Now, when we make value judgments, the first thing I want you to get is value judgments are based on anicca. Now, I'm going to go to the next page here really quickly, and then I'm going to go back to this one. Okay, this is the second slide titled Key Concepts that we're using right now. Again, you can take a screenshot of it if you'd like. On the next page here at the top, it says there's 3 characteristics of existence: dukkha, anicca, and anatta. Now, we just talked about dukkha, which is this suffering. Anicca means change, transience, impermanence. And there's 2 spellings there you'll see on the line right below dukkha, because one of them is Pali and one of them is Sanskrit, the 2 ancient sacred languages of India. But they're both pronounced anicca, and it means change, impermanence. Now, when I make a value judgment, what I'm making a value judgment on is how I wish things would change. Things never stay the same, right? It's often said that change is our greatest hope, and it's our greatest fear. We hope that things will change for the best, and we fear that they will change for the worst. Change, the fact that everything changes, is really what causes our suffering. Make sense? In fact, and you might want to remember this for a quiz question, I once was listening to a monk from Sri Lanka talking about the 4 Noble Truths. And when he mentioned the first noble truth, instead of saying all life is suffering, all life is dukkha, he actually said all life is anicca. And he meant the same thing. In other words, the suffering comes from the fact that everything is always changing. And we make value judgments about what good and bad changes are. And we long for the good changes. We hope for them. Sometimes we expect things to go a certain way. And life doesn't work that way. So saying that all life involves suffering or all life involves anicca is really kind of the same thing in a sense. Anyway, here's the deal. Even if we get our desire, this doesn't stop suffering, because now I have to worry about losing it. See, the problem is, if everything turns out just the way you want it to, you can't stop change. You can't say, okay, everything's perfect right now, change, stop. It doesn't work that way. Things keep changing. And what you like about today, there will come a time when that's not the way it is anymore. So sometimes the more you have, the more you worry about losing it. If I'm walking through a bad area of town with $20 in my pocket, I'm not really worried about getting robbed. I can survive the loss of $20. If I'm walking through a bad area of town and some rough guys are following me and I have $5,000 in my pocket, I'm a lot more worried about getting robbed because I have more to lose. Does that make sense? So even if we get our desire, now we fear losing it. What are our desires based on? They're based on value judgments, as I said, but they're based on value judgments about what we esteem good for ourself. We are self-centered. And I don't mean that in a bad or a good way, just factual. Everything I see is through the how it affects me. Now, that doesn't mean I don't care about other people. When my daughter was run down by the drunk driver in the hypothetical story, didn't really happen. I had a student a few years ago that sent me an email and goes, I'm so sorry to hear about your daughter. God, I've been crying all afternoon. I'm like, it was a story I made up. So I try to make it clear that these stories are made up so nobody feels sorry for me. My daughter is alive and well, and I've got 3 grandkids. And 2 of them are probably older than some of you guys are. Anyway, because I'm really, really old. But we're self-centered. And when I make a value judgment, something is good or something's bad, it's because of how it affects me. Now, if someone I love gets hurt, that affects me in a bad way. Okay, I don't like that at all. But it's me that's being affected here. Now, when I make a decision about what's good or what's bad, it's based on how things affect my self-image, how things affect my self-worth, my value, my self-esteem, okay? And things that affect my self-esteem in a good way, I say they're good. Things that make me feel less valuable, that make me feel worse about myself, I say are bad. Does anybody enjoy getting fired from a job? Somebody wanted to pay you money at one point to do a job, and now they're saying, you're not worth anything. That's demoralizing. What if you're in love with someone and your whole life revolves around them, and one day they come and they say, look, I used to love you. I don't know what went wrong, but I don't love you anymore, and I don't want to talk to you or see you anymore. Bye. How are you going to handle that? I mean, assuming you still love the person, you thought they were going to be around forever. That's pretty demoralizing, right? So this is because this affects my self-image. I've looked to that person in this case to be the person on earth who most is going to confirm to me on a daily basis that I'm a valuable person, okay, that I'm appreciated. And once that person looks at me and says, you don't have any value anymore, that's a tragedy. That's a crisis, okay? And this is the way life is, right? And so we're constantly trying to put ourselves in situations that are self-affirming. My greatest fear, we talked about in the very beginning of the semester, is losing myself, losing what I consider to be of greatest value. But anything that takes away my value brings me a little bit closer to the negating of self. And I desperately try to avoid things that make me feel bad about myself. Okay? If there's 2 girls that I can ask to the prom, and one of them is just drop dead gorgeous. I mean, I've never seen a prettier girl in my life, but I'm not sure she likes me. And I very much suspect that if I ask her to the prom, she's going to say, with you? Yeah, right. I'm not going to ask her to the prom because I don't want to deal with the way I'm going to feel when she looks at me like, really, you're asking me? I would never go to the prom with you. Now there's a second girl, and she's good looking too. I mean, she's not a beauty queen maybe, but she's a sweet girl. She's smart, and I can tell she likes me. Whenever I say hi, she just looks like it just made her day. And I know if I ask her to the prom, she's going to be beaming. I mean, she is going to be radiant. And how's that going to make me feel about myself? Wonderful. Who am I going to ask to the prom? That girl. And I'm sure you can come up with many other examples, but we do this, okay? We put ourselves in these situations. Why? Because we're cultivating our self-image. Now, what is the problem with self-image? Why don't I just decide what I want to think about myself and just think it? Well, the problem is this, okay? Our self-image is the product of all the experiences of our lives, which are largely out of our control. Now, we mentioned this earlier briefly, but think about it again. There's a big argument sometimes about nature versus nurture. Which more determines who you are? Your DNA that you get from your parents, or your nurture, that is the situations, the conditioning of how you were raised? It doesn't matter in this context because they're both out of your control. You don't control your DNA, right? You didn't choose how tall you were going to be, what gender you were going to be, what color your hair was going to be. You didn't choose anything about that. And most people, there's things they'd like to change about that, and they can't. How about nature and nurture? You didn't choose that either. You didn't choose, where you were going to be born, in what century, in what country, in what culture, in what religion, what the occupations of your parents were going to be, what their personalities were going to be, what opportunities would be available to you in that society, educationally or career-wise. Even with the same DNA, if I could make you born in a completely different situation, like I just described, you would end up being a very different person. Indisputable. So the point is, what you think about yourself is the result of everything you've experienced your entire life, largely out of your control. But life teaches us about ourselves. We're human beings. We define ourselves in relationship. We're social creatures. The kid that's, wearing the Coke bottle thick glasses, the nerdy kid that, one day he's going to make more than all of us put together because he's smart. But at this point, nobody likes him in the 6th grade, and every day after school he gets beat up. He is going to have a much lower self-image than the kid that, is the quarterback of the football team, the girl that's the homecoming queen. And it's not because he did anything to deserve to feel this way about himself. It's very easy to make a case for determinism, that, every decision you've made, everything you do, it was inevitable. Some people think that, they control their self-image, they have free will because they make decisions. But it's pretty easy to affirm that it was inevitable. Some people say, oh, no. When I signed up for this class, no. I thought long and hard about it. I prayed about it. I talked to counselors. I anguished over it for like 2 weeks. And finally, just after weighing everything out, I made a decision to take the class. I can say, yeah, based on everything you've experienced in your life and everything that it's made you and the way you've learned to respond to things, it was inevitable that you would pray deeply and seek all this advice and anguish over it for 2 weeks before finally deciding at the last moment to take the class. See how easy it is to affirm that? I don't want to argue about it. It's just very easy to affirm determinism. You don't control the world. You don't control the weather. You can't make the earth turn more slowly or more quickly. Things are largely out of your control. So my self-image is the result of everything I've experienced, forces out of my control. So if I want to change my self-image, do I have the power to do that? Well, that's a tricky question. Not by myself, I don't. Because if my self-image is the result of everything that I've learned about myself through other people, through situations that were out of my control, then I just can't manufacture new data to negate all of that. If people could do that, then everybody'd feel great about themselves. I could just look at myself and say, I don't like the way I feel about myself, so I'm just going to reprogram myself. And I just hit enter and now I'm fine. Problem solved. Doesn't work that way, does it? But everybody wishes it would. Many people are trying to fix their self-image, improve it, for many, many different reasons I don't need to go into. But here's the deal. When you talk about this, or you talk about the whole self-help industry, it's a little bit of a misnomer. Because you can't just help yourself. You need outside data. It's outside data that taught you who you were and what you are and helped you create your self-image. So if you want to change your self-image and improve it, you need better data. And the data has to come from outside you. So everything that you use, every method that you use to try and improve your self-image, self-help as we call it, utilizes outside data. For example, there was way back before you guys were born on Saturday Night Live, there was a character named Stuart Smalley, I think, and every morning he would get up, and he was just a dorky character. I think he was played by Al Franken. But anyway, he would get up and he would look in the mirror and he would go, "You're good enough, you're smart enough, and doggone it, people like you. And he would tell that to himself in the mirror every day to prepare him to go out and deal with life the way someone who liked himself would. And of course, the comedy was that somewhere along the line, everything would go wrong and he would have a mental breakdown. And of course, the mantra hadn't worked. But the point is this, past all of the comedy, even if the mantra does work, the only reason it works to look in the mirror and say, you're a good person, you have great qualities, many people are glad that you exist and you're a part of their life. The only reason that that works for me is because I heard that. I learned that somewhere else. Somebody else had to tell me that. I had to see that evidenced in somebody else's reaction to me. I can't just create the data. So this is what we're doing when we try to put ourselves in good and bad situations. I'm trying to put myself in situations where I can gain good data that I need to improve my self-image. And I'm trying to stay away from situations that will give me bad data that will make it worse than it is or confirm the bad way I already feel about myself. Remember we were just talking about that? So every kind of self-help, whether you're talking about, religious, whether you're talking about, life coaching or therapy or yoga or whatever, it's providing you new data that can be useful. And you can apply it in many ways, but you got to get it somewhere, okay? So, if my self-image is the result of everything that has ever happened in my life, where does it exist? Where does it exist? In the mind. It's based on the memory of everything I've ever learned about myself, everything I think about myself. It's here. We say, oh, no, I know it in my heart. No, your heart pumps blood. That's what it does. It's a nice poetic way of saying things. Did you know in ancient times, a lot of people thought that the seat of their emotions was in the bowels? Now think about it. You fall in love. People say, I have butterflies in my stomach, right? If you get really, really upset about something, you're really worried about something, sometimes you can get diarrhea. So you can understand why people might think that the seat of the emotions is in the stomach, just like some people might think that it's, in the chest. I mean, you feel a great heaviness in your chest, sometimes with great sorrow. But we know now, okay, that everything that you think, all of your volition, all of your feelings, they all exist here. And this is the brain that thinks this. Now the question is this. Does your self-image live on after you die? Do the thoughts of your brain live on after the brain that thought them dies? Well, that would be ridiculous to think that, wouldn't it? Because your brain's going to rot in the grave just like everything else. None of those synapses are firing anymore. After a while, it's all dirt. If you think your thoughts live on after the brain that thought them dies, that's like taking a flashlight, turning it on, and then while it's on, unscrewing the back and letting the batteries fall out and thinking that the light is going to stay on. It's just that ridiculous. So if everything you know about yourself is the self-image this life has taught you, then it dies with you. And that's what the Buddha says, what it means when he says there's no enduring identity. Identity is you identifying yourself. You look and you go, that is me. The way you think of yourself, your self-image, that's your identity. Okay? But everything you've ever thought about yourself dies when you stop thinking. The thoughts don't go on. So this self-image dies with you. Now here's the problem with this. And that is that, remember, Buddhism is in a sense a protest against Hinduism and some of the teachings in Hinduism 2,500 years ago in the Axial Age. And one of the things that the Buddha doesn't like is the idea that you have an eternal soul and that you have a responsibility to keep it, to protect it, to not lose it, And by the way, that would be your greatest responsibility, right? Well, it certainly is in Christianity and Judaism and Islam and every other religion that believes you have a soul. Your ultimate responsibility is to protect it, from any harm. You want it to be saved, not destroyed. You want it to have a good outcome. But the problem is this. Why do you think you have an eternal soul? Well, first of all, this happens in the Axial Age, where people first start to think that I must be more than my identity and my value in this life. Remember we talked about this? And this is when, we really start getting a lot of theology about this eternal soul that lives on after you die, that is perfectly you. And it's an identity that transcends everything in this life. If I'm born in a bad situation, I grow up hating myself, or I'm born in a good situation, and I grow up thinking that I'm a good person, well, it wouldn't be fair if those things that I thought about myself were my eternal soul, because I didn't choose where I was born, right? I mean, if there's a God, that wouldn't be very just or righteous, would it? But what would be just is if all of us had a value and identity beyond our value and our identity in this life, usually determined by vocation, And in that sense, we were all in some, greater reality, eternal reality, we were all equal. And one day, the king and the shepherd, they would all be equal. Make sense? And even if you're not religious, today people think like that. We talked about this in the axial age discussion, They look at someone who's better off than them and say, well, I'm just as valuable as they are. I'm just as much a human being. I'm just, they just had better opportunities than I did. Even if you're not religious, the axial age has caused us to think this way. So when people think of an eternal soul, they think of some eternal identity that is not changed at all by our advantages or disadvantages in this life, or it wouldn't be just, and that does not resemble, our identity in this life. It's a true identity. Now, here's the problem with that. What's your soul? Think about it. Imagine your soul. Imagine who you really are. Guess what? You can't. The only thing you can imagine is the self-image that you possess, your own identity as you see it, which of course is the result of things out of your control. So when most people who believe they have a soul think about their soul living on at the afterlife, what are they really thinking about? Pay attention. They're thinking about their self-image fixed. When you look at yourself, especially if you're a religious person that sees that, you don't live up to God's glory or whatever, you look at yourself and you see what's wrong with yourself and what you wish was better, and you think that when you finally get to heaven, hopefully you get there, that all these things are going to be fixed. You're no longer going to be 800 pounds. You won't have the wart on your nose anymore. You won't, whatever. People will like you then. So I'm being silly, but there are many things much more subtle than that we recognize are less than perfect about ourselves, and we'd like them to be better. Maybe we don't confess them to anybody. But when we think about living on to eternity, I think about the most perfect version of me I can imagine. But I start with my self-image. I start with this thing out of my control, and in my mind I try to fix it and imagine all these things fixed, and then imagine that person living on into eternity. But that's not my soul. That's my self-image fixed. And my self-image dies with me. I have no enduring identity of anything in my mind. My mind rots in the grave. So if I have a soul, and I'm not saying you don't, by the way, I would never say that. What I'm saying is, if you have an eternal soul that's something completely different than your self-image, you have no idea what it is. And if you have no idea what it is, what are the chances that you have any control over it? I can't even conceive of what it is, but you tell me that I somehow can protect it, or if I'm not careful, I'll lose it. How can I protect or lose something that I can't even conceive of? How would I know if I lost it? I don't even know what it is. Now, here's the problem with this. The big problem with this is when in a religion like Hinduism or Christianity or anything else that says that your responsibility is, to get your soul saved or, keep it from being lost or whatever. The problem is you have no idea what your soul is. So when someone tells you to save your soul, what are you really thinking about? You're thinking about your self-image fixed. I call this, remember this terminology, okay? I call this your sacred self-image, because according to whatever you believe, about God or the ultimate reality or who you really are, who you're going to be or whatever, you're starting with the raw material of your self-image. You got nothing else to work with, and you're fixing it in the point to your mind where you say, okay, this is according, to my religious beliefs. This is who I really am or who I really will be. So it's your self-image fixed. Let's call it your sacred self-image, okay? Your self-image, made acceptable to God or whatever is necessary. So when someone tells me to protect my soul, when someone tells me to, be worried about losing my soul, champion my soul, I'm trying to protect my self-image. It might be my sacred self-image, but I'm worried about my self-image being damaged. And if something deeply damages my self-image, it deeply damages my sacred self-image, and I feel like it's doing damage to my soul. So what you've done by telling people that they have to, take care of their soul is you have exacerbated their obsession with their self-image. And that obsession with the self-image is what causes all of our suffering. The value judgments are based on how things affect my self-image. Those value judgments are where the desires and hopes and expectations come from that get violated, that cause the existential suffering because I perceive some damage to me in the way things have turned out. So when you get right down to the root of it, it's all about this illusory self-image that I see being benefited, or I see being, detracted from, damaged. And this is my whole estimation of whether my soul's okay or whether it's not. The old hymn, it is well with my soul. How in the world do you know? What you're saying is, it's well with my sacred self-image. It's well with my sacred self-image. What you're saying is, I've gone through tragedy. I've gone through, horrible tempest, crisis. And all of these things had the potential to cause me, to lose faith in my sacred self-image. But I have it. I still believe in it, It's well with my sacred self-image. All of these bad things, demoralizing things that happen to me, no, I believe God's word. I have faith or whatever, and it hasn't damaged my sacred self-image. That's all you're really saying. But that sacred self-image dies with you. It's just you fixing that self-image that you had really no responsibility for creating in the first place. So the ultimate illusion in Buddhism is, not just the world. It's your whole idea of who you are. Now, if I don't really have anything that I can keep or anything that I could lose, it doesn't make sense that that should cause me suffering. But it's not about what we have to lose. It's about what we think we have to lose. Say I hypnotize. Pick a student in the class. I hypnotize Joe. And I tell Joe he's got $20 billion. If I woke him up right then, he'd be a lot more, uptight person. I mean, now he's got, 20 billion more things to be concerned about. But let's make it worse. Tell him he's got $20 billion, but right now, his CEO, his CFO, his financial advisor, his significant other, and a few other people are all in a conspiracy, and they're siphoning off all his money into offshore accounts. And if he doesn't figure out how they're doing it, in the next couple of months, he's going to be bankrupt. And now you wake him up from hypnosis. Is he suffering? Hell yes. Deeply. But is he suffering because he has $20 billion he might lose? No. He doesn't have $20 billion. He's got $10 in his pocket. He might buy a sandwich after the class. Why is he suffering? Because he thinks he has $20 billion to lose that's in jeopardy. I hope that it's been a quick illustration. Again, the ultimate illusion is who you think you are. And you get very attached to that. And all of these desires that cause suffering, that's what you got to get rid of. You got to cease the desires. Now, what are you going to do with the desires? You want to extinguish them. The term nirvana actually means extinguishing. Don't know if you knew that before. Actually means extinguishing. And you have to extinguish these desires, but to relieve yourself of the suffering. That's the third thing, cessation of desire and suffering. But before you can extinguish the desires, what else do you have to extinguish? You have to extinguish your idea of who you are. You have to realize that this identity doesn't live on after you die. And this is the third line here. See this? Anatta or anatman, it means no soul, no self, no enduring identity. Everything that you think is you dies with you. And you're far too attached to that. You're far too dedicated to trying to protect it and make sure that it, isn't lost. But there's nothing there. There's nothing that's real. It's just the way you think of yourself. When your brain dies, it dies with you. Wow. So if you're not a soul, then what in the world are you? Well, the Buddha would say that you are the result of 5 aggregates of the self that we call skandhas, or khandhas in the Pali. You don't need to know what they are. I'll put the page up if you want to look at them or research them more. This is your third slide, the 5 skandhas slide. Of course, you don't need to know anything on this. But the idea is, when you put together these 5 aggregates, you take someone, of course you have to have a material form, a physical body. You give them feeling or sensation, sensory input. They perceive things outside of them. Then they have some perception, cognition, recognition of what in fact these things are, and value judgments of good and bad go along with that. Next, they have volition and will. How are they going to respond to these things? And then last, they are, and this goes with the self-transcendence we talked about, they're conscious of the self that's doing all of these things, sensing things, perceiving them, making value judgments about them, and making decisions based on them. You're conscious of the person doing that, and you assume the person exists. That self's doing an awful lot. And so this, again, you don't need to know this, but anybody can look at this and go, yeah, I guess if you put all these things together, you've created a being that can think about who and what they are. Just because you can think about who and what you are doesn't necessarily mean that you're anything that lives on. If you're familiar with Rene Descartes, he said, I think, therefore I am, right? Well, many, many centuries before him, the Buddha, if he could have entered into a conversation with him, and Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, the Buddha would say, BS. You think, therefore you think you are. Given the ability to think about who and what you are, it is inevitable you'll come to the conclusion that you are something. Let's have a little visual example. This is a lighter. And it says, enjoy the little things. Must be a Buddhist lighter. Anyway, it's made up of a number of different parts. Since we're using it as a metaphor for the skandhas, let's say there's 5 parts, even though we know there's probably quite a few more. If I take all of the 5 parts apart, that's why they call them parts, because they come apart, and I lay the parts on the table, which part is the lighter? You have to answer the specific question. Which one part is the lighter? Which is the soul of the lighter? Which is the identity of the lighter? Which is the part that makes it a lighter? And the answer is none of them. Lighters don't exist naturally. You don't find them out in a field growing off of a thorn bush. We take different kinds of elements and different kinds of man-made materials and form them and put them together in such a way that we create this. But this is something that doesn't have any kind of natural existence. It's a tool. It's something we create. So when I take all of these different parts of the lighter apart, it's not a lighter anymore. So if I take all the pieces of the lighter, I put it back together in exactly the same way, you could say it's the same lighter. Now, I realize that there's a philosophical argument against that, but we're not going there. You put all the parts back together again, same lighter. So what does the lighter do? Well, if it's put together in the right way, it makes a flame. Wow. Is the flame the lighter? No. Is the lighter the flame? No. Where did the flame go? Now that's a very specific question, by the way. When you ask where did the flame go, what you're saying is, at what location does the flame now exist? Since, of course, it doesn't exist here. So where did the flame go? The answer must be no. Where? Which is saying, at no location does that flame that you saw 30 seconds ago exist. It's not in flame heaven. It's not in flame hell. It's not outside smoking a cigarette, which would be convenient because it always has a light because it's a flame. Is this the same lighter? Well, I don't know. I might have another one under here and I might have switched them. But no, I'm being honest. It's the same lighter. However, is this the same flame? Well, no, it's not. Because we identify the flame by the point, the duration of time in which it exists. And this is a different duration of time. It's a different flame. Same lighter, different flame. Where'd that flame go? No. Where? And let's say all the pieces of the lighter come apart, the skandhas, and they're in pieces. And all of a sudden, a whole bunch of karma with somebody's name stamped on it comes along and puts all those skandhas back together, and boom, you got it. And guess what? Here's a flame. Is it the first flame? No. Is it the second flame? No. It's a completely different flame. And now it's gone. Forever. You are the flame. When the skandhas come together, they produce a being that is able to think about who and what she is. And so she will come to the conclusion that she is something, and that something will be the most valuable thing in her life, and she will judge everything else in her life by how it affects her understanding of who she is. And it's the root of all her fears, it's the root of all her sufferings. And then she's gone. And it was all for nothing. There was no point in it. It accomplished nothing. It was worthless. You were worried about losing something that you couldn't have kept. Nobody could take it from you. You couldn't have kept it. It was an illusion. Okay, back to our story. And now we're going to talk about what I just mentioned, about karma putting the skandhas back together. And when you die, those skandhas that create this being that's able to think about who and what he is, they all dissipate. And reincarnation brings them back together again. The karma you have created brings the skandhas back together. And so it's called your reincarnation, not because, like in Hinduism, you have an eternal soul that transmigrates and is born in a different, body. Not at all. But because the karma you have created facilitates the rebirth. That's why it's your reincarnation. And the interesting thing is, in some sense, it does resemble you quite a lot, because the karma you're creating is the result of you sort of projecting yourself into everything that you do in your life. If I go and I feed the poor, maybe I'm being compassionate, maybe I really care about the poor, but I'm also making a decision what kind of self I want to be. I like myself a whole lot better when I'm feeding the poor than when I'm a selfish, curmudgeon. We've talked about this before, remember? So to completely get past any idea of self is really, really difficult. But according to the Buddha, that's what you have to do to stop making karmic waves. And you want to stop making them in Buddhism, not in Hinduism. Hinduism, you want all kinds of good karma. Buddhism, good karma is still better than bad karma. But if you want to break out of the cycle of rebirth and obtain nirvana, not be reincarnated, not have sufficient karma to reconstitute the skandhas, then you need to stop creating karmic waves. And karmic waves are when you project your idea of who you are in what you're doing. I'm not just feeding the poor because, they're hungry. I have food. I can give them food. It's more than that for me. It's like Steven's going to give them food. I like myself doing this. I've decided this is the kind of self I want to be. It's like taking a snapshot of who I think I am and sending it out into the cosmic continuum. And all of those karmic waves come together when I die and reconstitute the skandhas and create someone else. Why is it my reincarnation? Why does it resemble me? Because I have created the schematic that is used to create the new person. All of it is based on all of these projections I've put out on who and what I think I am. These are all just like snapshots going out in the universe of me and how I see myself. If I had a machine that could analyze every molecule in your body and then create someone identical to you that would step out of the machine, would it be you? No. It'd be a copy of you. It might be identical when it first steps out of the machine, but not for long. After the first couple minutes, you're thinking different things. You're sitting in the seat. It's coming out of the machine. Trust me, you're not seeing yourselves in the same way. You're different people from that point on. By the way, this is an interesting Hollywood genre, cloning, where there's a whole bunch of clones of somebody in the future, and the clones get into a war because each of them wants to believe that they're the original and everybody else are clones of them. Isn't that interesting? And cloning is a big problem if you think you have a soul, too. Because if we learn to clone people and we start doing it, are they born with a soul? If God didn't create them? If so, they're less than human. They're soulless people. Do they have the same rights as people that have souls? Or if they do have a soul, where's it coming from? Is God up in heaven going, oh, darn it, they cloned another person. I better slap a soul in him. And as fast as we make people, God's slapping souls in them so they're not like some kind of inhuman monstrosity. You see the problem with this? Anyway, the Buddha recognizes this, and whether you agree with his theological views, it doesn't matter. In terms of, the human psyche, in terms of psychology and how we cause ourselves suffering, he's on point. Perfect. Absolutely none of this is disputable in any credible way. And whether you care anything about Buddhism, whether you're religious in any sense at all, you can be a philosophical atheist, but there's something that you can learn here about this, and that is to not take yourself and your self-image so seriously and realize that the way things affect you, it's the natural result of how it makes you feel, but all of that is illusory. And the more you detach yourself from your obsession with who you are and what makes you better, the less you are going to suffer when things don't go the way that you would want them to go. The less you're going to make the kind of value judgments that results in the desires and hopes and expectations that cause suffering. I hope it's been quick. I hope it's made some sense. We're going to stop this one right now. We're about the length of a class, and there's going to be a part 2 that is going to be available. Check it out.